weight loss improves health.
Right.
It's pretty across the board. So if someone were to say, hey, I'm not going to do anything, I'm not going to exercise, I'm not going to eat healthily, but I'm going to take this medication. Now, do I recommend that? Absolutely not. And most of the more, evidence-based practitioners and doctors are going to be saying the same thing, right? If you come off of it, you don't have the habits and skills, the behaviors to sustain the weight loss. You have that food hunger and that drive come back. Yeah, you're going to gain all the weight back, 100%.
My guest today is Guynn, physique coach. He is a bodybuilder and physique coach. He helps intermediate to advanced lifters break free from rigid plans and overcome plateaus. You can find Dylan on Instagram at DylanGuynPC. Guynn, welcome to the American Glutton podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for doing this. We met at a gym with a mutual friend who's also been on the show, Ian. And I'm impressed by you, bro. You're fucking awesome. I looked at your IG and just your physique. You look amazing. You're a bodybuilder coach.
I appreciate that a lot. Thank you so much.
I find for myself, there was a point in my life where I had gained and lost weight so many times that I was like, this is just my life. It's going to be 6 months of dieting, rapid weight loss, and then slow accumulation for another 6 months or a year. And then it will be just this cycle of weight loss. And that was the thing that attracted me to bodybuilding at first, was like, yeah, that's what they do. They just lose and gain weight. But what I liked was it was all less severe. So they got to a place where they weren't, you don't look, I mean, they're big guys, but they're not like obese in the off season. They're, like talking to guys like Ian. Ian's like, yeah, I'm fluffy. So fluffy is like a word that I was like, God, if I could just be fluffy, that would be amazing. And so the swings seemed so much less severe that it was like, well, these dudes are gaining or losing weight all the time. I can do that. Let me try that and get to a place where I'm good. And in doing that, I found maintenance and was like, oh, well, I could also just do maintenance and learn maintenance really well. And I've basically maintained my weight now for almost 6 years. And it was amazing. But does that, like with you or with your clients, that gaining and losing mentality mess with you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to ask you real quick. Are you familiar with Lee Priest?
No.
Okay. He's like a bodybuilder from the 90s, but there's some photos that are pretty popular of him. And he was one of those guys who was really known for really pushing his off seasons, like getting to probably obese status, right, and then dieting for a show and then getting like shredded. Is that the best way to go about it? I can't wait to
look this guy up. I cannot.
Yeah. There's literally a photo of him holding a KFC bucket, and it's like, I've seen it everywhere. So it's really funny. Phenomenal physique.
Yeah.
Is that the best way to do it? Probably not. Right. There's a lot of things that come along with large drops in weight and large fluctuations, from a psychological standpoint, from a physiological standpoint, that just make it really hard. And I think that, sorry, what was your question again? Because
I'm just interested. Like for me, I was resigned to this idea of weight gain and weight loss. And my first kind of brush with bodybuilders, it was like, we're massing or we're cutting. We're massing or we're cutting. I didn't know there were real maintenance periods built in. And even the first time I did maintenance, the very first time, it was such a struggle that it was just like being on a diet, so, I just wonder if that gain loss kind of mentality is tricky for you guys.
Yeah. So what I was getting to is it is. And I think especially when trying to push to like really make progress, there have been times where me personally, and I try to now be mindful of if a client is experiencing this, how it's affecting me psychologically, right? Because from a bodybuilding perspective, like you mentioned, like you know, bodybuilders have this skewed perception of how they look as well, right? I think I was watching a podcast and you mentioned you have this as well, right? Where it's kind of like a body dysmorphic thing where you feel like you know look a certain way. So bodybuilders, they'll be like 18% body fat, 16, somewhere in the high teens, and they'll still have abs, but they'll be like, this is fat for me, right? And I experienced that as well. And so there also kind of comes a point where psychologically, you know, you're doing this thing and you're like, I did this because I wanted to look a certain way, and maybe even for health reasons, which we can kind of get into for enhanced bodybuilding a little bit. But where you're like, wow, I don't know if this is really like, this isn't, you know, I don't feel great about how I look right now. I'd like to be looking like I'm, you know, in shape and like a bodybuilder. You know, you'll be big in a t-shirt, but you take off your t-shirt, maybe not as much so. And one thing that we've I think pretty much most bodybuilders experience this at some point, is kind of chasing the dragon, so to speak, a dirty bulking, right? They push that surplus so far thinking they're going to get additional gains, and some of them do it on and off for years. I know I did, and realizing that it just doesn't yield a whole lot of benefit. And then you also start to get health degradations when you start getting up into those high teens and pushing beyond that, especially as you are pushing your body weight up. So yeah, I just try to kind of be mindful of it. I actually, as a coach and as a bodybuilder myself, have leaned towards just staying generally leaner if you can. So this isn't always done in one go, meaning like someone comes to me, they're in the high teens. You know, I'm not going to might not push them all the way through to a contest prep. It's segmented. Like you mentioned, maintenance is really important. Maintenance is how you sustain these gains. It's how you are able to maintain weight loss. And so I might have them diet down from like a 20 to like a 12. And then the next time they come back up, they might come up to like a 16%, 18%. And each time we're kind of moving them into a range where it's like we're trying to move their settling point, but we're not doing it in one go, because that can be a lot. But yes, it is something that is challenging, and I don't think gets talked about a lot. And I think that there's two sides. There's the people who push it really hard and then have to diet off 50, 60 pounds to get on stage. And then there's the people who never really push it at all. And, you know, you have to be in a surplus. You have to gain a little bit of fat to make progress too. So
yeah, it got very tricky for me because when I initially started, I was like, okay, I'm going to diet down. I didn't know about maintenance when I first was like thinking about like, well, I'll just be a bodybuilder, right? It was like these fucking, I'm gonna wind up resorting to the mean, which for me is overeating, or dieting. So at least if I focus it and I'm in the gym every day, I could maybe get somewhere doing this. That was my thought process. And then as I started to read about it, and I read about diet breaks and maintenance and all of that, first of all, it was very hard for me to go on to maintenance while losing weight, because I'm like, no, I've got momentum, I've got inertia, I'm heading towards this destination. I don't want to interrupt that. So there's that. And then once on maintenance, I kind of was like, well, why would I intentionally gain weight? That's crazy. Like, I'm not gonna be a professional bodybuilder. And I have, at that time, I assume it's more because I have continued to work out 6 days a week for it's been 2 years since I got a DEXA scan. But my last DEXA scan, I was 223 pounds of lean tissue with 11 pounds of calcium, or however they do bones. Yeah. That's a pretty heavy, that's a lot of mass. And I was like, that's fine. I could just maintain this. Like, what if I tried that? Maintenance proved to be very, very tough, because for me, that's just a diet. You know, I am intentionally withholding food while on maintenance. It just, over time, I realized like, oh, I'm not actually hungry. My desire to eat is not hunger. It's a compulsion. It's a habit that I've formed. It's the mental baggage that I've got to work on, which is completely separate. And then when I did finally do a massing phase, it was just really unhealthy for me. It'd be like if somebody said, like, you got to go wine tasting and you're going to drink wine every day. And I'm a sober guy, and it just would not be a good scene.
Yeah. 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 Because you've experienced the overeating before and you kind of have those tendencies. So like going to a mass gain phase, you feel like maybe is kind of like a rabbit hole that you might fall into. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I did it. And I was just, it, you know, every day when my weight crept above maintenance and then just kept going every day. And, you know, even talking to guys about this and them going like, well, just so you know, that's not 3 pounds of fat in a day. A lot of that's water. And I understand that. But once we're at 10, 12, 15 pounds, I'm like, well, some of that is fat. That's not all water, you know?
Right.
And it was rough. So, but you know, I don't need to do that. I'm actually very happy doing maintenance and like having figured that out feels like a cheat code to me. And I will say though, it was so much work at the beginning. It didn't feel like a cheat code at all. It felt like any diet.
Like you were still dieting almost.
It was, I mean, it was objectively a diet simply because I was restricting food. You can't eat whatever you want. And it took a long time to like really dial it in. And I was doing calculations constantly. And now I don't do that. I don't have to. It is just kind of how I live. And I can look at a plate of food and know whether it's in range enough for me or not, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. We see, we see these adaptations that occur when you lose a lot of weight. They take time. They take a lot of time. So if you go to maintenance, you know, that first month, that first 2 months, I mean, in your case, we're talking, you know, obviously it wasn't all in one go, but like hundreds of pounds. Now you have some psychological stuff that you need to recover too. Maintenance is as much about physiological recovery as it is about psychological recovery from dieting. Because in your case, like you felt like, hey, I'm just like you're doing this yo-yo thing and you're just like using your willpower all the time. And that burns you out, right? And eventually you're like, all right, well, diet hard for 6 months, get burnt out. Go back to eating, you know, when am I ready to diet again, right?
Well, also, especially when the 6 months of hard dieting doesn't even get you to where, to a place where you're happy with, you know?
Yeah. And I've had that. I've had people experience physiological symptoms of dieting when not losing weight just because they felt like restricted for 6 months.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, most definitely. And so that's the thing about maintenance is it is a hard initially. And that's we talk about in bodybuilding, like coming out of a show prep is harder than the diet for the show.
Right.
Because you have no immediate goal ahead and you still have all of these adaptations you need to recover from. You need to get back to normal eating. And for some people, like I know for myself, it's about like 3 or 4 months for me personally until I start getting normal eating behaviors back. Like you can, and a lot of bodybuilders in contest prep experience disordered like eating behavior. So it takes time.
Is it just the urge to overeat? Is your body just going like, you starved me so much, give me more food?
Yeah. So it's a number of things. Like I mentioned, it's physiological and psychological, right? Your body is setting you up for regain. It has what's referred to as metabolic adaptation, right? So we're in famine right now. So let's set up these systems so that when food is available, we need to get as much down as we can and store it. So that if this happens again, we have stored energy for you know the future. So you get the hunger hormones upregulating, right? Your sleep gets disrupted as well because your body is just like you're keeping you up so that you can eat food. And then psychologically, just from the actual restriction, because it does kind of get extreme at some point because you have to be very, very picky about where the calories are coming from. All of that adds up. And so that just kind of, and then in enhanced bodybuilding, you have other drugs that can drive hunger as well. So it's just, it's a number of those things, but at the end of the day, it is still human, you know, it's physiology, right? So whether you're dieting to get really lean or you're dieting and you've lost a significant amount of weight, you still generally do experience similar side effects from doing so. So even with a bodybuilder, I would still generally break up their diet. If they're losing more than 10% of their weight, you know, having them lose 50 pounds in one go is still stressful on the body and doesn't lead to always the best look on stage.
Right.
As well.
Yeah. There's something, I have a tinfoil hat theory to that plays on something you said, which is I kind of just believe that like the rate of obesity right now correlates to like the advent of housewives beginning dieting these crazy diets in like the 1950s and 60s. And like, because there was no real obesity, we had processed foods. After World War One, we had this abundance of processed foods, and so you saw a little bit of weight gain, and suddenly there were all these crazy diets. One was like eat 2 hard-boiled eggs and a bottle of Chablis. Like that
Yeah.
was a diet. Um, Certainly you'll lose weight doing that, but like probably not the best strategy. And so you then had a generation that was switched on to that metabolic adaptation, whose bodies were going like, our genes remember our parents' genes starving. So we are turned on to want to find food and store it. And then there's an abundance of food. And so we have, you know what I mean? Like, I think it
Yeah.
was like this magical scenario where I do think the dieting plays a role in obesity, because people want to lose weight fast and then the weight comes back even faster. It's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah. I can't speak to the epigenetic changes that might occur. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some, meaning like say your family has been living in famine for generations and that's just the way your genes are set up for sure.
Right.
I know that there are, and I can't speak on them too much, certain adaptations and things that happen if based on your mother's eating behavior while you're in the womb. But I do know that obesity, I think, and I could misquote this, it's like 70% heritable.
Right.
Meaning like if you have obese parents, your likelihood of being obese when you're in the correct environment is pretty high, right? So there's certain things that drive that, and I think that, you know, like I know it kind of in my family is something that that we experience, and I know that if I probably wasn't involved in bodybuilding, I'd likely be overweight or obese, just with my general drive to eat. Like I'm one of you see a lot of this in actual in bodybuilding where people are, you know, either they have a hard time cutting for shows, but they can gain mass really easily. And then you have the people who are can get in shape really easily, but have a hard time gaining tissue. And I'm the former, where
Right.
I can eat, you know, all day long. And so if I wasn't supplementing with all this added activity, and in my case also anabolics and stuff like that, my body composition would probably and I've experienced that too with the mass gaining, where I have a tendency to overdo it if I'm not careful. Like I feel like if I overdo it by a couple hundred calories, I feel like, you know, over 6 months or something like that, I'm
You
like,
got to get
whoa,
new pants. Yeah.
100%. And I've had that historically. So, and I actually personally started leveraging GLP-1s, which we can talk about in a little bit for that reason as well.
Yeah. How does that's got to be a boon to bodybuilding. Those
Yeah.
peptides.
How so?
Just because so much of it is about dieting
Yeah.
and cutting
Yeah.
weight. And that's it, like it doesn't really matter who you are. If you're restricting your food, that's not easy.
No. Yeah. Well, you got to be careful because bodybuilding is also a sport that tends to reward suffering.
Right.
And maybe not for the sake of it improves the outcome, but it maybe is because the people who
I like suffering. I'm a fan of
Yes.
suffering. So much of my life I spent like avoiding discomfort. And now I think that for me, to suffer with an intention to get something positive at the end, to get like delayed gratification, suffer now so that you have a benefit later on, is so great. But I know what you're talking about, where it's just like suffer and be your most unhealthy for an hour, and we're going to take a picture of you and judge that picture. And that's what the prize is.
Well, and when what you mentioned is the key is for the outcome, right? For for what we're going for. And so when doing so, I try to encourage this to all of my clients, and even ask myself this, is like, is what I'm doing, is it, what's the term I'm looking for? Is it supporting the outcome I'm after, right? Because if not, then it's needless suffering. And if that's something that you truly enjoy, sure. But bodybuilding also, especially as you get become higher and higher level competitors, is about push and pull and knowing when it is appropriate to pull back. And if you look at any of these higher level guys, their coaches are having them do refeeds, they're having them take time off, they're having them pull back oftentimes because of how hard they have to push their body. So, yeah, I think that it's not as common. I think it was very like the Dorian Yates era. Are you familiar with Dorian Yates? I
Sure.
imagine. Yeah, yeah. So like that was very like intensity focused. Go every set to failure. Live in a a basement gym dungeon. Don't talk to anybody kind of deal. And that mentality also attracted a lot of people to bodybuilding who maybe felt a little bit ostracized or isolated or whatever it might be. And they admire that a lot. And I think that's great. But I think that asking yourself why you're in the gym, asking yourself why you're doing anything, and being upfront about the trade-offs of that is really important. So like, hey, I, for example, choose to not use these peptides, but I think a lot of these guys like will say, because you have to suffer when you're dieting. It's like, well, we already are suffering in many other ways. Like there's so many other things that are going on. If this thing, which this does have performance enhancing benefits, which I'll get to, helps improve my outcome on stage, as much as suffering is something that we find, sometimes we find it therapeutic in ways. If I'm trying to do this at a high competitive level, I need to be aware of those trade-offs and say, okay, I'm just choosing to push through this thing because I like the feeling of dieting, which some people do. In my case, I try. I'm very much like, you had Jared as your coach. We align on a lot of those things, and I think are kind of it's becoming more common, but we somewhat are still outliers in the sake of like, hey, what is the thing that's going to support the best outcome? Let's do that, and do that always, right? And if that changes, then I'm willing to change with that, as opposed to here's this training method, Dorian did it, so I'm going to do it. I don't care what anything else is. So yeah, anyway, GLP-1s for bodybuilding are super, super helpful because
what are the performance enhancing aspects?
Well, you're going to grow 10 times the amount of, no, I'm just kidding. They're on, I think, 4th or 5th generation. They already have ones that are actually causing body recomposition, which is insane. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think they're going through, I don't know, phase 1 or phase 2 testing now. And Mike Israetel talks about this a little bit in his content, where muscle growth is essentially it's a chemical signaling process. You lift weights, you create tension that stimulates certain chemicals to be released, and then that starts the whole muscle protein synthesis, starts the whole process.
Let me ask you this, and maybe you don't know, but do you think this is a reaction to so many people losing so much lean tissue so quickly while on them?
Yeah, yeah, and that's why resistance training is so important while on them. But what we have, you've talked about this in your content, is a very obesogenic environment, but we have evolution that takes a long time to catch up to that. And this thing is very recent, like you said, 50s, and even in the last, especially 20, 30 years or whatever, we've had it really skyrocket, right? And the environment is changing so quickly. We're becoming more sedentary. This food is more accessible. It's cheaper. And our bodies just aren't catching up with that. So I think that there is definitely utility. Like I'm very much so the coach that's like, everybody should exercise, everybody should eat healthy, 100%. But with the environments changing so quickly, and with the obesity rates still climbing, something like this is very valuable. And I think in conjunction with exercise. But yeah, so they have them that are now, and I think what it'll probably be is, and Mike has mentioned this before, is like we'll probably have medications that maybe you'll have to do half the amount of exercise for a while. Maybe eventually it'll be that you just take a pill and you just look the way you want.
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, when I was a kid, I prayed for the magical pill that would make me not fat. I wanted it so bad. And then there were periods in my life where there were signs. When I was very young, I was put on fen, and we got excited, like this is going to do it. And it didn't. And I was on it for a few days, didn't sleep, and was quickly taken off of it, thankfully, because some people had really terrible side effects from fen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I did not. Sleeplessness for 3 days is not the end of the world. But for a very young kid, it wasn't great. And then there was a HCG, I think it's called.
Oh
And
yeah.
that was sold to me as like, this is what happens in
The
pregnant
HCG
women's
diet.
bodies. Yeah. So you do this diet and you get these shots from a doctor, and it's going to make your body will produce more testosterone. So you're not going to lose any muscle. And this is how it was sold to me. And the reality is the diet was 500 calories a day
Yes, the
for
500
everyone.
calorie. I
Didn't
remember reading about
matter if
this.
you were 500 pounds or 200 pounds, you eat 500 calories a day. And I did that in 30 days. I lost a shitload of weight. But you know, I didn't get to my desired result, and it sucked. It wasn't a miraculous thing where I can eat 500 calories a day and feel great. So I'm still slightly on the fence about believing that there's a miracle, but it seems like there's a miracle. It seems
Yeah.
from what I've seen and read that these things are miraculous. And the fact that some diabetics have been taking them for 15 years and aren't growing third arms, you know, I still think, like, for me, I'm a sober person, and a lot of my issues were not about hunger. So you take away my hunger, that doesn't mean I'm not trying to fill a different void within myself with food.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so that's like my worry for myself. I've also got a structure that I'm really happy with, so I don't want to mess with that. But for people who, you know, if it was like 2018 and these drugs came on the market, I'm sure I would be on them. 100% for sure.
Yeah. If you have been struggling for a long time and you have this thing that can help. Yeah.
But I guess my worry would be more for mostly the gals who need to lose 15 or 20 pounds or want to lose like, do you really need to lose that? I don't know if we can get into need versus want at that point.
Right.
And you lose the weight very rapidly. You come off the thing, you rapidly reaccumulate fat, but not lean tissue. You're not going to the gym. So over time in that population, do we see actually an increase of body fat percentage because they're losing lean tissue and fat, but they're only regaining fat? And so that worries me a little bit. But like, cocaine also worries me. I don't think, you know, I think to get a nose job, they pack your sinuses with cocaine. I don't want to eradicate cocaine because I have a problem with it. You know, that's not how I do the world.
Yeah. I didn't know that. Yeah. I mean, I'll start by first and foremost saying that, you know, weight loss improves health. And it's pretty across the board. And the downsides of, for example, muscle loss or sarcopenia are probably far outweighed by the downsides of being overweight. So if someone were to say, hey, I'm not going to do anything, not going to exercise, I'm not going to eat healthily, but I'm going to take this medication. Look, I'm not going to judge someone for that. I would definitely be the person saying you should definitely lift weights and eat enough protein and have a good diet.
Right.
But it's going to improve their health outcome. It's going to improve their quality of life. They're going to be around longer for their family. It's less burden on the healthcare system. You know, there's lots of things there's probably a positive there. Now, do I recommend that? Absolutely not. And most of the more, you know, evidence-based practitioners and doctors are going to be saying the same thing, right? As a quick fix, you know, like you said, if you come off of it, you don't have the habits and skills, the behaviors to sustain the weight loss. You have that food hunger and that drive come back. Yeah, you're going to gain all the weight back, 100%. And this is a medication for individuals who have obesity as a disease state, who have a high level of baseline hunger. They're probably going to need to be on these medications for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a subset. In your case, you were saying like a lot of it was maybe more on the psychological side. I think there's psychological, and then there's also the physiological, where there's just a lot of food noise all the time. They're you know, a 7 out of 10 all the time. They eat a whole meal of potatoes and lean beef and carrots or whatever, a whole watermelon or whatever, and they're still like, where do I find food, right? So for them, I think this medication is appropriate. But that being said, yeah, having those habits, behaviors, and implementing these habits, behaviors can allow someone to take less, which is less money, right? Allowing them to take less over time. In a bodybuilding context, I think it's just used sparingly for certain circumstances. Um, but yeah, and then as far as the side effects of the medications, like I think, there's kind of like that people think, that there's some like, big pharma's out to get us, and there's always some side effect. They want us fat and sick, whatever. Whether or not you buy into that at all, I won't comment on that. But I do think that the medications are getting so good that the side effect profile is getting very low. There's some of these cholesterol medications are very, very low side effects, and they're improving people's longevity and lifespan and health span. Same with a lot of these blood pressure medications, like I take one, telmisartan, the ARBs. I think one of the main purported side effects of it is like a cough, right? But now you have low blood pressure, which means your likelihood of suffering a cardiac event in later life is much lower. So right. I think that because medication is getting so advanced, medicine is getting so advanced, the trade-offs are becoming less. At this point, we're just looking at cost, particular for GLP-1s, particular types of thyroid cancer, like a specific type, which is a counterindication, and then some things with how it affects the slowing of gastric emptying. But the instance of these, when you actually look at the data, is very, very low. So again,
let me ask you a question, just so I understand thyroid cancer. The slowing of gastric emptying, that means like it takes you longer once you eat for it to move through your intestines.
Which is the benefit of the drug, right? Because it slows gastric emptying, like something like a fiber and other like protein, things like that do. It causes the actual the stretch reflexes in the stomach and the intestines to sense that there's food and fullness for longer. It also allows a more stable, and this is probably why it has some of the blood sugar benefits, some more stable blood glucose entering the bloodstream as well. But I think it's like I don't even know pancreatitis, some of these other things that are more rare than what gets reported in the media, right? So there'll be a few instances, and they'll be like, "Hey, look, see, this is what this drug is doing," and it's like if you look at the data, it's a lot more of a rare occurrence. And again, weighing these against weight loss for a lot of people, the trade-off is worth it for the risk, and that's a conversation they need to have with their doctor. So yeah, but I think they should be resistance training. I think they should be eating protein because, especially as you enter, you're going to lose muscle mass if you don't exercise when you're on these medications. And as you enter old age, then you have the risk of falling, which is like one of the highest causes of death in old age: falling, breaking your hip, losing independence, if it's not the event itself. So yeah, I think that they should be resistance training. They should be eating enough protein. And I think those also will improve their quality of life. Like you might still not feel great if you have no muscle mass and you're 20-pound lighter version of yourself. You'll probably feel better, but
yeah, it's one of those things too, though, where like you could benefit from resistance training and eating more protein, whether you're on it or not. And like, I listen, I understand the other side of everything you've said. Like I didn't like pharmaceutical companies for the, I grew up with hippie parents who I was forced to eat health food. Like when I hear these people talking about like, we will eradicate obesity if we just get rid of processed foods, I'm like, okay, I grew up an obese kid. I was obese, from the time I was 6 years old until the rest of my life, basically. And my mom never allowed sugar in the house, ever.
Yeah.
Occasionally as a reward for being good. And I'm putting that in quotes because I was always sneaking food. My mom would take me to a drive-through and like not watch me eat it because she didn't want to witness me eating the chemicals. But that wasn't even like weekly. That was like a very occasional thing. As a reward, I would get this junk food, but it wasn't a common part of our diet. So the idea that like, I think probably statistically it would have a big effect if we made sugar illegal or regulated it, probably have a big effect, but it's not going to handle every individual, It certainly doesn't handle me. It's a very complex issue. So there's that. And then the other flip side is like, so I had these hippie parents who were not into medicine. And when my daughter, this goes back 15 years, We were in Europe. She kept having to pee all the time. We didn't know. My wife, she was 4, started giving her cranberry juice because she thought she had a UTI. We get back. She's still not sleeping, has to urinate constantly, looks dehydrated, constantly thirsty. We take her to a doctor, and the doctor says, you have to rush to the hospital. Didn't tell us what was going on. We take our kid to the hospital. Her blood sugar was 900. And a normal blood sugar should never go above 120.
Yeah.
And when we're like, oh, okay, what does that mean? And they're like, your daughter has diabetes. And we're like, oh shit. And so they say, we're going to start her on insulin. And me and my wife are like, no, you're not. We don't want to medicate her. We'll handle it with diet. And we just didn't know. We had to sit in the doctor's office for hours while they explained to us exactly what was going on in her body. Yeah. And we finally went like, okay, yes, please give her insulin. And then I spent years like literally poring over research about this. And I'm like so grateful for pharmaceutical companies. They're saving her life every single day. And it really shifted the way I thought about it. Well, if they're saving my daughter's life every single day, then they're not just evil corporations, Yeah. I think if you have somebody who is dependent on medication for life, you will change your attitude about pharmaceutical companies real quick. There's still financial problems. We went to Canada once, and on the trip, she broke her vial of insulin, and I was frantic, but then the pharmacy just was willing to sell it to us without a prescription for like 5% of what it costs in America. So yes, there are still issues there, but the company is producing something and making it available to us that saves my daughter's life every single day. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Yeah. I mean, it is something that the time we're living in, I think you generally look at it, people, especially on like social media, you'll see it's generally just more pessimistic view of everything. Everything's getting worse. But the some of these things that were, the people were dying in masses of are not even issues anymore. Like certain diseases, certain illnesses are not even a problem because of vaccinations, because of certain medications. When diabetes was first happening, or not first happening, but when they were trying to treat it, I mean, they didn't know what to do. I'm pretty sure they were just like, you're all right, you got this much time to live before insulin and all that stuff. It's like,
dude, there are pictures of children in hospital wings wasting away and dying, and they could not help them. Yeah, it's so sad. And this is, type 2 diabetes. There is a lot of evidence that you can catch that early, change your habits, and make a big effect on that. Type 1 diabetes, they really shouldn't be called the same thing because they're two completely different things.
Yeah, because it's an immune response, right? Type 1.
Her immune system attacked the beta cells in her pancreas, and her body produces vastly less insulin than any other body. So her body just doesn't have the insulin. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance, which is caused typically by what you eat. You eat foods that, and you overwhelm your system with glucose, and the insulin doesn't work as well. Right. So they're just completely different things.
Yeah. And GLP-1s, that's the original, like you said, about 15 years, and that was the original intention. And they started realizing that people's glucose is improving, and probably in part due to the medication itself, but also they were losing weight. And so they're like, okay, we need to get this for weight loss as well, because that is something that is burdening our healthcare system and something that could help people. And from a pharmaceutical standpoint, we're going to make lots of money, but they make money by making products that help people generally. And that being said, like I think you mentioning that, like the hesitations, like I watched the show. I've been watching the show House a lot, and a lot of the what he deals with in the show, and then obviously I know it's a dramatization, but is that like the hesitations, patients being honest, the patients having hesitations to the medications, and like in your case, like you were not informed on this thing, and the doctor sat you down and said, hey, this is going to save your daughter's life. She needs this thing, and you're like, okay, at that point you're like, I don't care if it's medicine or not, just save my daughter's life, make sure she can live a full life and have good quality of life, right? Now, when you go into any doctor's office, they're not always looking at like, they're like, I get 30 minutes with this patient. what can I do so that they at least don't die early
Right.
enough? Like, I'm going to tell them to exercise. I'm going to tell them to lift weights, but I'm going to give them this medication so that their cholesterol isn't high or their blood pressure isn't high. Because the longer they have high blood pressure and high cholesterol, the more likely the chance of them having a heart attack and dying or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So there's also that side. But 100%, I think, like you said, there's issues with our healthcare system. There's definitely things. It's not a dichotomous thing where it's like we have this one solution. Same with obesity, where let's just give everybody semaglutide. Like, no, let's give everybody semaglutide, get them to change their lifestyle, which is also a hard thing. But I will say that when I have clients who have been struggling for a long time, they're doing all the things. They're tracking their macros. They're eating enough protein. They're exercising. There's times where we're just like, I'm having them send me pictures of what they're eating, like, and they're being very upfront with me. It's like they get on this medication, and because they're struggling, and they get on this medication, and it is the one thing that enables them to be able to make the lifestyle changes that they were struggling with.
Right.
And so if it can enable them to make those lifestyle changes, and now they can gain that momentum, gain that win of like, oh, I lost 10 pounds. I'm not starving all the time. I don't have to keep fighting my willpower. I'm going to start exercising a little bit more. I'm feeling good. I'm looking good. That can just kind of, create this spiral effect of where it just kind of keeps compounding and compounding. And that is something I've seen, which has been amazing to see, especially people who've been struggling for a while.
Yeah. The hunger is such an interesting thing. I notice in my life today that I will make poor decisions if I'm hungry. And so I have to set up my life in a way that I'm ahead of that, I'm not making the decisions too late. Like, I'm not going to the grocery store overly hungry and making the decision right then.
Yeah.
But the reality is, like, I didn't get to the weight I was at because I was just so hungry. It really had nothing to do with hunger. And so I do think, like, I could totally envision doing a crash diet and not experiencing hunger and it being easier. But even that, it wasn't ever the hunger that got to me.
Yeah.
It was the other stuff. It was like, I'm still a very anxious person. Now I have to figure out how to, either allow the anxiety to take over and like investigate what it feels like to be anxious and like realize that I'm going to be okay, or I am in fact okay. But hunger is a real interesting thing. And I think if you have, people who struggle with that, I'm very happy if they've got a way out.
Right. And I try to identify that, I'm not the one prescribing these medications. I try to get them to go to their doctor, but I will say, like, I mean, I've had clients who have been prescribed it before, who, like you mentioned, are more on the psychological side of things, and they'll eat through the hunger.
Right.
And they'll be like, I'm throwing up, I'm very nauseous. This is worse. So you hear some of these stories. I think some people just are very sensitive to the medication and they get side effects and maybe they need to try a different one. But some people will eat through that hunger signaling because they're not paying attention to hunger signaling. They're just eating for to fill some other need, right? And so being able to identify that, right? And I generally will be kind of talking to them about like how their hunger is and if their drive to eat is more physiological or psychological or a combination of the two. Yeah, and in that case, like you said, I mean, I think there was probably, and you've talked about this, where you did a lot of psychological work to get where you're at. And that was probably one of the bigger things. Obviously, the lifestyle stuff, making it more sustainable, all that's very important too. But also dealing with the underlying, because even in physique sport, like, you get people who want to change their outward appearance, and sometimes it's not for the correct reasons. And so they get to whatever outcome and they're still struggling, right? And maybe that it is a ticking time bomb before they rebound back to whatever they are, or they just stay at this low body fat and they're miserable.
That is one of the wildest things. Like, you can have in your head, like, if I'm X body fat percentage at X weight, this is going to be perfect. And for me, whenever I got to those places, I wasn't happy. That's another thing to like take into consideration with all of this. Like, I'm just unfortunately also have to like figure out a way to congratulate myself on objective things that I've achieved with my physicality, which I'm working on every day, but I also will be forever, without having that finish line, because that finish line, I'm like, okay, Yeah, I mean, it's better than it was 2 weeks ago, but it's still not. And I've actually got the producer of the show is taking the not the Wegovy, the other one,
Okay.
um,
Manjaro.
Mongiorno,
Yeah.
yeah, and even she, she wanted to lose 40 pounds. This was her goal, 40 pounds. And she got to 40 pounds and she was like, so like without going like, I've had to reevaluate and X, Y, and Z, she's like, I need to lose 10 more pounds. And you're I'm like, what, will you be happy at 10 more pounds? Like, is there another,
Yeah.
because my wife has been telling me about the 2 pounds she wants to lose no matter what weight she is for years.
Yeah.
And those 2 pounds haunt her and she'll lose them. And it's still 2 pounds that she needs to lose. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that we think that it's all about the outcome. We think that it's like in my case, I want to be a professional and I want to do this thing, I want to win this show or whatever it might be. But I think if you do it long enough, hopefully you eventually see that it is not about that. And it is more about the process and, all of the things that come along with that. Right. Like, and focusing on the outcome can be something that's very burdensome. And when you get there, you realize like, oh, this isn't what I imagined it to be. You imagine when I achieve this outcome, I'm going to be happy. And it's like, well, no, the happiness is in the day to day. The happiness is not in this future thing that you're trying to achieve, right? So maybe it takes you enough times. It took me. I remember even in a personal experience, like buying my dream car, and then I was like, well, this is fun, but like, it didn't
Yeah.
really
What
change
now?
me.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And it's always the next thing, right? So, and I think you've realized this, and I did too. More so as like, I love to lift weights. I love to eat healthily, and I love what it does for me. And as a result, I get a better body composition. I get to look better and feel better and stuff like that, and that's awesome. But on the day to day, like I enjoy my day to day, like finding the exercise that I enjoy, finding the diet style that I like, and it makes me feel fulfilled. So I think that in this, I think yes, I think that people most definitely there's people who by losing weight, they're going to feel better and it's going to improve their quality of life. But I think that, as a bodybuilder, I can speak for this is like, I've done my best over time to not identify as a bodybuilder, identify with someone of this size. Right. And I imagine you maybe had some of this when you were overweight, where you're dealing with a certain identity that was associated with that. And when you lost all of that weight, like you actually, that's one of your slogans is like killed my clone. Right.
Yeah.
So like, it's like when you lost all that weight, you fundamentally had to change the certain things that you were when you were at that weight. And I try my best to not identify with like, as much as I love bodybuilding, my physique is a separate entity. I'm Dylan first and I'm a bodybuilder second. Right.
Right.
And I think it can be a really slippery slope when you start to tie your identity into these things and say, I'm this big muscular person and I can't, do anything else. And this is what I do. I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, no, I like what you're saying, but I think this is very key to people who lose weight too, because a lot, I mean, and this was my experience was I expect this this weight loss to fundamentally change how I feel about myself. And it just didn't do that.
Yeah.
And like, honestly, I only go to the gym now because I feel better when I leave. That's it. That's the only reason. I'm not in there praying for bigger pecs. I don't need bigger pecs. My pecs are perfectly fine.
Yeah.
If they could grow a little bit, that'd be fine. But I'm not in there like killing myself like Dorian Yates going like, you must grow. Nothing like that.
Yeah.
I go in there and I have an idea of what I'm going to do pretty specifically, and I do it and I always feel better. And that's what keeps me going back.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, I almost never want to go. It's always a little bit of like, get out of bed, fucking move, get up, because I suffer from like the opposite of whatever the marshmallow drill taught kids, where like, eat one now or two later, like that delayed gratification.
Oh, yeah.
I want gratification right now. That's just drilled into me. So Would I be more comfortable right now laying in bed and turning the TV on and ordering Postmates? 100%. But I would feel miserable later, and I'll feel way better after the gym than I do right now. So that's what gets me there.
Yeah. Yeah. Most definitely. Yeah. The comfort thing can be a slippery slope. And I think learning how to lean into that and knowing that, like you said, like when I get to the gym, I feel so much better. That is a big part of especially building the initial habit to do so. Like it may become a little bit more, you know, like you don't have to think about it. It doesn't require as much willpower. But even then, on certain days, like I know I'm dragging. Like I think people look at someone who, like even in my case where I'm coaching people to do this, and it's like, yeah, he just does it. It's like, no, like it still takes me, especially when I'm dieting, like it's effortful and it's hard. And that's something that I've been learning too. I know I've always done this thing, but really leaning into that when it feels that way is like, yes, but in my case, I always think of like how I would feel if I just sat in bed or how I would feel if I didn't do this thing. So I definitely can relate to that a lot.
Yeah. I wonder what it is. I almost think sometimes when people are like evangelizing for a diet, if it's like they need you to do the diet they're doing because the more people that do it will prove to themselves that it's right, almost a little bit, like
Need the validation.
yeah, like you see
Yeah.
this with keto people where it's like everybody needs to be keto. And even in this conversation, you talked about figuring out what worked for you, the way you eat. I suspect you and I probably eat in similar ways: high protein, moderate carbs, lowish fat. Um, but like I don't think that either of us would try to sell the world that everybody has to eat that way.
Yeah.
That's another interesting thing about this whole space where there's contention over these medications that could possibly turn people's lives around, and there's just as much contention over like the way people should eat. There's
Yeah.
people out there like, let's eradicate processed foods, and or the all plants people or the all meat people. It's like, so it gets to be like we're in a religious space almost.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think that one, it ties to human psychology, right? I think people also identify with not just the diet, but the group around the diet and things like that, and they feel a sense of belonging within that. So that can be challenging. I think when someone actually understands the principles behind it, and again, they're looking for the outcome. They're not looking to feel validated by doing something. In your case, you've learned these principles, and it took you trying all of that stuff.
Dude, I was dieting for 20 years before I figured out something that worked for me long term. That's all.
Exactly. And it's different for everybody. Everybody hopefully reaches that point at some point, right? It took me, I think, like maybe 10. And it's like a lot of the consultations is I'm not trying to like sell anybody on my training style per se. It's usually about the time where they're pretty fed up is when I'm getting them in for a consultation. And then they're like, yeah, I've tried this, 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 and this, and it didn't work. And so it's like, okay, well, what's the likelihood that if you continue to do these things, that it's going to work on another style of diet where it's overly restricted or whatever? It's like, oh, probably not. Let's do a more balanced approach and focus more on the principles of what drives these changes that you're looking for, such as, eating a lot of fiber, eating a lot of protein, exercising consistently. And I think that's the thing that gets overlooked is the actual just consistency of a plan. Because in your case, it was sustaining those things was one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah.
It's like you could get the outcome you're after, but could you maintain that long term?
Yeah.
That was where it was, the struggle.
Yeah. There's so much nuance to all of this. And I really do still hold so much love in my heart for bodybuilders, because that's a struggle, man. That's real work.
Yeah. Getting down to the essential body fats is something else, but I think that it is much so. I think if you're in it for the right reasons, it feels like it's worth it, right? And it is a fun, for as much as it sucks during, it is an enjoyable process to see your physique change. For me, it's about the challenge. It's about, like, I find myself, even when I'm preparing, I'm not really like, we were talking about like identity and stuff. I don't really like look at my physique a whole lot, except for when I do like my check-ins. I do love to see the visual changes and what I've been able to build as a result of this work. But it is about like stringing together these really good days and these really good workouts and adhering to the diet and stuff like that. So I think that, you know, as much as I think it does get put on a pedestal and it is difficult, I think that, you know, the people who are involved in it is very much a passion thing, especially with how little money is involved in this sport.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wild. It does seem lopsided. I'm always kind of amazed at how much attention it gets for, you know, you're not talking about $100 million contracts for anyone.
Yeah. Well, and I think that luckily because of social media, people have been able to leverage that. Like you look at someone like Chris Bumstead, like right now, what he's leveraged with his social media presence and being able to do that is awesome. And obviously this is really like the top of the sport, but you know, most of us are coaching and helping other people and doing competing as a kind of just, you know, most people are not the top of the sport making contracts and making hundreds of thousands of dollars, whatever. They're just doing it purely out of their own pocket because they enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
And I think there's some reasons why. I think like classic physique is probably is helping bringing that to the mainstream. But you know, obviously with the apparent drug use, it's hard to say if it'll ever become like a real mainstream thing.
Right.
The person who got me into bodybuilding, Flex Wheeler. I mean, I think when they in the '90s they were televising it on ESPN and stuff. So, you know, I think there's a potential for that to happen in the future. But you know, we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Dylan, this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, dude, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure. I think just even running into you, like I said, I've been a big fan. I actually was watching some of your movies this weekend too. But
that's awesome.
It's really cool to see you in this space and you speaking about well, one, having these conversations, and two, speaking about a little more evidence-based stuff because it's refreshing. You know, as you've mentioned, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So,
you know, it's so tricky because I do think there are people out there saying things, making universal claims that are objectively not universal.
Yeah.
And they believe them. And I don't think these people are dumb people, but it is kind of the Feynman principle. Number one, do not allow yourself to be fooled. You are the easiest person to fool, you know? Yeah. And I experienced that for so long. I believed that lectins were the culprit, or that I wasn't eating right for my blood type, or that you know, it was processed foods, or that it was carbohydrates, or that I had grain brain. I believed all of that stuff. And it just never got me there. And I kept going back, you know, and this is cognitive dissonance. You know, this is the definition. This is how insanity is defined.
Right.
But it like, and for me, it's super embarrassing because I'm a sober person, and I really just had to apply those same kind of ideas to the way I ate, which is, number one, this condition is with me for life, period. There is no finish line. There is no finish line to my sobriety. And since I can't be abstinent from food, shit, it's gotten even more complicated. Yeah. And I'm probably going to have to put some effort into it every day for the rest of my life. And I've got to be okay with that too. Or I've got to be okay with being really overweight, one or the other. But otherwise I'm just going to be miserable. And I don't want to be miserable anymore, you know?
So, and let me ask you this real quick. So what was it that, you know, like I know this wasn't one instance, but was there an instance where you're like, I'm going to start doing things differently, where that major change happened?
Well, there was like my rock bottom with drugs and alcohol was I was going to die. I was told by it. I was in congestive heart failure, and I had swelling that was moving up my body from my feet. And I was told, like, when this hits your chest, you're dead. Your heart can't beat under this swelling. Yeah. And, and that was enough. You know, it was very strange because leading up to that, before I had that prognosis, or that diagnosis, I would go to bed thinking I'll probably die in my sleep. And it didn't scare me enough to like get me off the drugs or try to change my life. But having a doctor sit and tell me that was like, oh, this is real. I'm really dying.
Yeah.
With food, I had an uncomfortable conversation. And I will say this, I tried a few times prior to that to get sober. But the idea was like, if I can get off opiates for a few weeks, I'll be okay to drink alcohol, and then I'll just drink alcohol. And then within a few days of going back on alcohol, I was back on heroin or crack cocaine. With food, because you can't be abstinent from food, I kept just considering my weight is the problem. If I can reduce my weight, the problem will be gone. And that's not, for me, the right way to look at it. And it took a long time, many, many years for me to go, oh, it's just the same shit. I just need to, I need to create some boundaries for myself that I don't cross ever. And I need to like figure out why I'm behaving this way and work on that. And that was super helpful. And I needed to put like real strict boundaries on the way I ate for a long time. And now I'm relaxed a little bit, but I'm not so relaxed I'm going to have a slice of pizza, because one slice of pizza makes me want to eat a second slice so much that it's just not worth it. But in the past 5 years, I've had a couple of slices of pizza. Yeah. It's not completely off limits. I also don't want to moralize food and say this is bad and this is good. No, I react poorer to one than I do to the other. So I don't mess around with that one. And that's just the way my life works. You know what I mean? But there were many years where I was like telling everybody that I was allergic to carbohydrates, and I would say this with a straight face, not having achieved anything I wanted to achieve. I mean, I'd achieved weight loss. I could lose weight. And after the first 2 weeks, it slowed down a lot and it was a grind, but I would lose weight. And then weight loss would utterly stop, nowhere near a weight I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And then I would just have to, in order to lose weight at that point, reduce what I was eating and be really hungry all the time. And then it was like, well, fuck, if I'm doing this, why am I not just counting calories? If I'm counting calories basically by reducing food, I don't know. It was a lot, but it took a long time before I found something that I was like, oh, this gets me to a place that all my health metrics are good. I'm happy with myself. And, as happy as I can be, I still have many, many instances of feeling very fat and have to like, slap myself around a little bit and go look in the mirror for real, find something about yourself that's not horrendous to look at.
Yeah.
But it took a long time and a lot of work and investigation. And like, it took me to being open to finding solutions that weren't like dogmatic and being sold to me like snake oil, like miracles. Like I wanted all these miracles. And that's the other thing that scares me personally about GLP-1s is like the miracle will allow me to behave badly. And I really actually prefer my life behaving in a way that suits my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm definitely here to say it, like these medications are great, but they are not to be used in that way. I don't think that's a great way to use them. I think a great way to use them is to allow them to complement and allow as a catalyst to develop habits and behaviors, not as I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to take this medication. It's like, all right. I mean,
no, I totally agree. I think they're amazing. They're going to change. And I agree with you too. Like if given being morbidly obese or not, and taking some of the side effects of, they don't sound all that bad. I think I would choose the medication for sure. And I think like with any medication, like I'm not here going like we should eradicate painkillers. I can't 100%. Take painkillers.
They're appropriate in certain instances, right? Like if someone does all of the lifestyle things to reduce their blood pressure, they're exercising, they lost weight, they are eating healthy, and their blood pressure is still high. Okay, that might be a time for considering blood pressure medication.
Take some blood,
What else are you going to do? Yeah. Right.
It could save your life. Yeah. 100%. Like, 100%. We weren't going to change my kid's life by getting her to stop eating sugar. It wasn't going to do anything for her. 100%. Her body's converting protein into sugar at that point,
Yeah, but there's still great things that you could do to help with managing, maybe taking less insulin, whatever it might be. But it's, accepting the fact that the medication might be necessary is also important too. So.
That's right. That's right. Dylan, thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, likewise, Ethan. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, man.
See you, dude.
See ya.